This video is sponsored by NordVPN. So we may be a couple months into the new year, but that doesn't mean it's too late to make a positive change, and why not do so with the help of NordVPN? What do I mean by that exactly? Well, in case you somehow haven't watched enough YouTube to already have heard of this, having a VPN is a no-brainer both for safety and recreation. For example, if you're looking to travel more in 2024, NordVPN can actually help keep you safe whenever you connect to public Wi-Fi. And you may be thinking, yeah, I've already heard this before, whatever. But what if I told you that a VPN could even get you cheaper flights? I'm sure we've all seen this happen when planning trips. We see a price and then come back later and everything's suddenly different. Help mitigate that with NordVPN, and who knows what kind of doors might open up. Still not interested? Well, then here's where I reiterate some of the other perks that come with using NordVPN. Want to access geo-block content like all the stuff that Netflix doesn't let you have? Simply connect to any of Nord's 5,400 servers in over 60 countries and see what's out there for you to discover. Live in a state that blocks certain sites, you know what I mean? NordVPN can help there too, and even better, use it freely on up to 6 devices. Right now, NordVPN is offering a very special deal where you can get a 2-year plan at a massive discount, plus 4 whole months absolutely free. Just head on over to nordvpn.com/reignbot to take advantage of this deal, and if you're still not satisfied, simply fall back on Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's nordvpn.com/reignbot, and remember, when you support the sponsors, you're also supporting the channel. Thanks so much in advance, and let's get into it. So what I have for you today is a piece of media that I have been wanting to talk about for ages now, and I mean literal years. As for why, have you ever stumbled upon something that you thought you understood, but the longer you stare at it, the worse it becomes? And I'm talking genuine unease, like a feeling that something is off. It's a sensation that horror media strives to achieve, but very seldom actually manages to nail. And while what creeps me out might not creep the next person out, this mockumentary definitely got me. Now, what exactly am I talking about? The film is called Psycho: The Large Family, a 2009 mockumentary from Japan that I actually found on YouTube some number of years ago. Now, I cannot for the life of me tell you exactly how I stumbled upon it, but there are a couple different uploads, and honestly, I really did not know what I was looking at first. I believe it only took me maybe a couple of minutes to realize that it was a work of fiction, but other than that, I seriously had no idea what I was about to experience. That said, as many of you know, I'm a lifelong horror nerd, and one thing that I really, truly miss is actually being afraid, unnerved, disturbed, whatever you want to call it, by a movie. That feeling that I used to get as a kid when I watched stuff like The Ring for the very first time and I couldn't be alone in the dark for the next few months. Psycho: The Large Family creeped me the hell out, but it wasn't through conventional means, and in fact, this movie somehow managed to creep me out again on second viewing. In a world where we've had discussion after discussion about why jump scares suck, this film goes in the opposite direction, almost to a fault actually, but if you pay close enough attention, then at least in my opinion, you're in for one hell of a ride. Before I get into details though, I'd like to explain the events of the film, which I of course encourage you to watch for yourself first. After that, I'll dig a bit deeper and get into the subtle things that many could have easily missed when watching this movie, and in my opinion, the true source of its merit as a piece of horror media. The film opens up with cheap logos and lackluster narration brought to us by one Veronica Addison, a Western documentary filmmaker attempting to understand the life of the Ura family of Saitama, Japan.
Hello, my name is Veronica Addison. Currently, Japan has a big problem with a declining birth rate. Since the 1950s, in advanced countries, this has been a great problem. It's no exaggeration that the falling birth rate is now a serious problem in the world. It's therefore that I'm reporting on a very large family in Japan. How does this family live?
As the title implies, the Uras are a rather large family. Instead of 2 parents and say 1 or 2 kids, they have several. The premise is interesting enough. After all, whole TV shows have centered around much the same thing, but Veronica presents the Uras as especially unique in Japan given its reputation for having an aging population and declining birth rate. A little side note before we continue. The vibe this film gives off reminds me a lot of this NHK World docuseries called Japanology. I've never heard anyone else talk about it before, but it's presented by this little old British man that's been living there since the 70s or so, and especially in earlier seasons, the presentation, editing, and just everything about the show was delightfully awkward and low budget. When I first stumbled upon this series, it was tough getting through episodes without at least a little secondhand embarrassment, but the saving grace of this show is just how truly dedicated it's been to documenting as much as possible. Sure, you'll get your usual episodes talking about samurai, Tokyo temples, all the things you'd expect, but they even cover often overlooked but nonetheless timeless Japanese cultural staples such as moss, male aesthetics, scissors, unused fish, cardboard, and much more. And yes, they seriously do have a full half-hour documentary dedicated to things like Japanese scissors and cardboard, and yes, they're actually interesting. But anyway, my point in all this is that Veronica and her documentary give off much the same energy, in my opinion, bland and sometimes jarring in its presentation, but nonetheless genuine in its curiosity towards its chosen subject matter. A date on screen puts us at April 2009 as Veronica and her translator happen upon the mother of the family, picking vegetables with a couple of the younger children. We follow them inside, and suddenly the chaos of the family's breakfast routine becomes apparent. With barely enough space to shimmy past each other, they prepare their meals, and before we know it, a noticeable silence breaks through as they start eating. The family has Veronica try natto because it's funny, and we're introduced to everyone one by one via text.
Every morning in the Ura family, the father, mother, and the children gather together and have breakfast in a very lively way. It seems pleasant to have breakfast with so many lively children.
今日さ、久しぶりにさ、夜外食とか行かない？
That's a total of 9 people, a pretty large household in most parts of the world. Now, the film is already dropping certain hints. For example, Sumio, who I'm just going to refer to as the dad from now on since there are a lot of names to remember, is 39 years old. The eldest daughter present is 24, meaning dad clearly is not her biological father unless he was an extremely young parent. Anyone who caught this detail wouldn't be left wondering for long, however, because of what transpires next.
外食とか。すごい味噌汁美味しいよ。たまにはいいんじゃない？外食。でもわかめもっと多くていいんじゃね？あ、確かにわかめ2枚しか入ってなかった。ねえお姉ちゃん、わかめだよねメインは。でも2枚でしょ2枚でしょ。俺1枚しかやってなかったもん。なんかリクエストある人？はい。もう何食べたい？ハンバーグ？スパゲッティ？ダンは？焼肉とか？じゃあそこら辺で。りえちゃんなんかある？お肉とかさ、お寿司とかどう？まあお寿司っても寿司いいよね。りえちゃんなんか食べたいもん聞きたいな。まあちょっと大した祝いっていう感じにはちょっとできねえ。りえちゃん、まあ遠慮しないで言ってよ。りえちゃん。じゃあ焼肉とかしようか。ね。
I can't show this part even if nothing really all that bad happens because I don't want YouTube to smite me, but the point is, Rie is very much behaving in an abusive manner and no one really seems to do anything about it, save for the mother who eventually steps in. Brother Ryuta, the sibling closest to Rie in age, pours miso soup on the dad and then the pair leave the dining room.
What a fearful sight! I was stunned at what I witnessed within this Japanese family. What has happened to the Japan where the father was highly respected alongside the samurai traditions? This attitude can be seen so often in recent years in Japan. It becomes a social phenomenon. This attitude is called in Japan katenai boyoku.
After stumbling through that pronunciation, Veronica heads to another room where dad can be found being patched up by mom. Now, behind Dad is a shrine that is normally dedicated to loved ones who have passed, although at this point in the story, no such person has been brought up, and we can't 100% tell who it's supposed to be based on the picture. Veronica asks the dad if he's okay, and this is when we get a little more context on what happened at the dining table. It's revealed that, as we thought, this man was actually relatively new to the family overall, having only biologically fathered the 2 youngest children while the rest he adopted. The other kid's biological father had gone missing a whole 7 years before. We aren't really given much more detail other than that, like if they suspect foul play or if he could have wanted to disappear. What happened the day he went missing? Veronica doesn't really pry, and while it's a bit disappointing right now, it also makes sense given that the documentary is supposed to be about the family now, and not a true crime piece about a missing father. Of course, the mother of the family says that it was a struggle once her first husband had vanished. She was a single mom to several children who only had a part-time job. And speaking of said job, that's actually where she met the now acting stepdad of the family. He tells the camera of the respect that he had for the mother, knowing that she was struggling through raising her kids all on her own. He then continues explaining how he was orphaned at a young age and always wanted a family of his own. Overall, it's all quite heartfelt, and at this point in the story, we do get the feeling that this new father figure to the family is just genuinely a nice guy who wants to be as good a dad as he can be. This cuts deep because the kids, especially the older ones, have beyond rejected him. Now, having said that, the parents of the household do also mention how, despite having children together, they're not yet officially married. We cut to quick interviews with some of the children who describe their new dad in a negative light, saying things that I'm sure anyone who has dealt with a step-parent situation has already heard. It's your standard, he's not my real dad, or he's annoying type things. Next, we find Mom with the 2 youngest children, the rest of the household seemingly cleared out for either school or work. Veronica asks if Mom still works herself, and to that she expresses that she wishes that she could but can't, and although she doesn't say why, we can assume the next scene has something to do with it. Mom prepares food in the kitchen, plates it up, and then carries it down the hallway to a room. She knocks and then says, "Here's your meal," to someone off screen who we don't get to see. Veronica asks about it, and this is when we learn that there was someone else at the house all along, who we simply have not been introduced to yet. Goki, the eldest son at age 23, is a shut-in, someone who insists on staying in his room unless he needs to use the bathroom or bathe. He doesn't work, nor attend school, or socialize at all. In fact, it seems the only human contact he gets is when his mother brings him his meals. Through voiceover, Veronica explains that Goki is a high school dropout. The pictures we're shown here definitely giving off your standard juvenile delinquent vibes. We're then treated to another helping of Veronica struggling to pronounce Japanese. Of course, the scene has another thing that sticks out about it, the writing on the walls. Veronica asks about it, and Mom explains that Goki loved baseball, and at some point he'd gotten into calligraphy. The stuff on the walls allegedly saying things like 10 strikeouts or bat a ball. More on why any of that matters later, but for now we cut over to dinner, where the family is once again united. We see Mika and the 24-year-old daughter leave for her hospital night shift, then jump over to 11 p.m. where some of the younger children have gone to sleep. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad are spotted talking alone. They mention Rie, who again is only 16, and how she still has not come home for the night. They of course sounded concerned, but nothing seemed to imply that this was unusual for Rie, even if the parents didn't prefer it. The father then asked Mom about someone by the name of Ringo, and just like that, yet another family member is revealed to us. If you recall, when the children of the household were introduced, their birth order was also listed alongside their names. We started with the second son and second daughter. We've learned that the first son is a shut-in living at the house this whole time, but what about the first daughter? Well, much like her father, the eldest daughter Ringo is missing. She's 25 years old and left for Tokyo 3 years prior for university. At first things seem fine, but for the last 6 months, no one has been able to get a hold of Ringo. Her parents of course tried calling her, but the number she had no longer works. And when they phoned her job, all they could say was that she quit. Now, this is when Dad adds that Ringo was against her mother getting remarried, and that he felt responsible for her going missing. His words carry a certain weight about them, making it apparent that he sees it as his duty to bring Ringo back home. The next day, we find him doing exactly that. A title card reads Yokohama City, Kanagawa Prefecture. The father is here because he received a tip from one of Ringo's friends that she might be in the area. As for where specifically, that becomes apparent as the dad walks down seemingly dodgy alleys and eventually arrives at an establishment that you can just tell is seedy, even without looking at any of the signage.
It was a dirty shop. Japanese call this kind of shop Fuzoku-ten.
Next, we take a look at the establishment's website, which has a list of girls who work there, and one in particular sticks out: Apple. Now, Apple is of course a stage name. The girl's face is blurred, but we can assume that both the friends and stepfather would be able to recognize Ringo, and to make things even more certain, the listed age happens to match as well. In the film, Veronica's voiceover sounds surprised by the name Apple, and this isn't really explained for English speakers. One might assume that she's just sort of poking fun at such an unusual stage name, but this matters because Ringo is actually the Japanese word for apple. So yeah, in short, this girl is 1000% the girl that we're looking for. Back to the film, we see Dad calling the establishment and booking an appointment with Apple, and then we see him entering the place all spy-like with a hidden camera built into his bag. Apple does not seem to recognize the man in front of her at first, and for a brief moment we're left to wonder if somehow this isn't Ringo after all. Dad gently confronts Apple multiple times and asks her to come home, to which Apple plays dumb at first, but after some time, we see her body language shift and things finally break. Apple, who is most definitely Ringo, becomes angry and calls on security to get Dad kicked out. He returns home to break the news to Mom, who, of course, starts crying. Meanwhile, Dad reiterates his determination to bring Ringo back home, and now especially so since he knows how she's been living. We next see the family 1 week later. Veronica explains that while the documentary crew were gone, Dad had returned to Yokohama and tried several times to convince Ringo to come home, but to no avail. Before we get the chance to expand on that though, yet another problem pops up out of nowhere. Ryuta, the 17-year-old son, is found right outside the house unconscious after an apparent fall from the second story. He's clearly got a head injury and needs medical attention ASAP. An ambulance is called, and in order to speed things up, the father actually carries Ryuta off the property to meet with emergency personnel. The next day, Veronica visits the family at the hospital, where Dad explains that Ryuta was still unconscious and that they'd almost lost him. One of the younger children present at the time chimes in, adding that Remon, age 13, also had suffered an accident the year prior while riding her bike. Again, more on this later. Back at the family home, Mom is interviewed. She says that she wants to be at the hospital but can't because she has to look after her eldest son. We get a wide shot of this, and here we see a basket of fruit with 2 knives in it that's never addressed or acknowledged by any of the characters in the film, but much like everything else I've talked about, more on that later. 3 days following this, Dad is back at Yokohama yet again. He catches Ringo as she leaves work and breaks the news about Ryuta being hospitalized. This seems to finally get Ringo to at least hear this man out. They continue their talk at a park bench, and what we get next is this long, very quiet sequence of the dad once again trying very gently to convince Ringo to come home. He speaks and for the most part is met with silence. That is, until Ringo starts to break down crying. She says that she cannot come home, and it's revealed to us that Ringo didn't actually go missing completely by choice. Veronica tells us via voiceover that Ringo was dating a guy and took on his debt, which is what forced her into this line of work in the first place. Again, I don't want YouTube to block this video or anything like that, but if we're being real here, what this means is that Ringo was essentially a victim of trafficking. From here, we cut to 2 days later, and we're back at the hospital where things with Ryuta have drastically improved. He was finally awake and even seemingly in a good mood. We jump straight into another time skip right after this, to another few days later, and somehow none other than Ringo can be seen making her way back to the family home. We learn that Dad had pulled some strings and basically dipped into what sounded like his retirement fund to pay off the $50,000 debt that Ringo was unjustly forced to take on, and for all intents and purposes, she was free. We skip forward yet another week, and by all accounts, everything in the Ura household seemed to be better than they've ever been. Ryuta was on the mend, and Ringo was finally safe. On top of that, mealtime seemed much more upbeat. Dad could chime in more easily and naturally, and while all the other kids seemed to be warming up to him, the same could not be said for Rie, who once again had to ruin things with a physical outburst. This time, Ringo stepped in to stop Rie, and unlike last time we saw this happen, the rest of the children seemed to be more on Dad's side. And improvement overall, of course, but it doesn't feel like happy moments ever last in this household. The next time Veronica visits the Uras, she finds them in the backyard doing a family workout, which Dad is leading. They're smiling and again looking much happier together overall, and to add to a happy moment, Mom and Dad reveal to Veronica that the two are finally able to get legally married. They explain that it took so long because, of course, Mom's last husband went missing, which meant that even with him gone, she was not legally divorced. With 7 years gone by, the husband was now legally considered deceased, allowing Mom to both remarry and collect life insurance money. We next cut to the household at lunchtime, and with Ringo home to help out, this time she brings food to her brother's room, and we get to partially see inside before the door is closed rather hastily. Next, Veronica and her crew stumble upon this. We then cut to the interior of the home where the children are being interviewed about what just happened. One of them is drawing a cat with red markings on it, and I'll leave it up to you to interpret that. Another child explains to Veronica that they saw the ghost of Enrique by the garden, and a third child explains that Enrique was the name of their cat that had passed away and was subsequently buried near the garden. While the younger kids in this room right now are drawing and stuff like that, one of them is doing homework, and Veronica actually asks what he's working on, but more on that later. What we get following this is a little unorthodox compared to the rest. It's a sequence that cuts between various scenes as a woman sings Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and while I'm not certain if this was intended to be creepy, in many ways it certainly is. I'd rather play it for you, of course, but this version of the song happens to be copyrighted. Nonetheless, I felt it was important to mention what happens during it anyway. We get shots of Mom tending to her garden while she has this sort of plastered-on, permanent-looking smile on her face. Then we head back down the hallway to the eldest son's room, finally having an opportunity to peek inside a bit more. What do we see? More calligraphy, which is clearly being showcased for reasons I'll get into later. I sound like a broken record, I apologize, I will break all this down soon. Following this is a quick shot of the dining room where the fruit basket from before can be seen yet again, but this time it has several knives as opposed to the original 2. The music stops and we finally find ourselves back at the table yet again. The family is enjoying their meals as usual when Dad suddenly asks if anyone wants to move out of the house. He continues saying that he feels like it would be a good idea since he and Mom are finally officially married. A fresh start, so to speak. The house does appear old after all, so why not? Now, as he's explaining this though, Mom has this expression on her face that tells us she's less than thrilled. And then she finally says that she's not sure about leaving, which we can obviously gather means that she actually does not want to leave. The next time that we see the family after this, We actually don't see them at all. The camera appears to have been left on the floor still rolling while Mom and Dad can be heard off-screen speaking very softly to each other and maybe doing other things as well, but let's not get into that. Dad says that he thinks that there's something in the house, but doesn't outright say what it could be. Instead, he lists off the children's accidents, Ringo's situation, Goki's withdrawal, etc. Basically the overall misfortune that seems to trail just behind this group of people. Mom says there isn't any money to move, especially after paying off Ringo's debt. Then Dad says, quote, "The money you told me about, will you be getting it soon?" Dad mentions that he only asked because the two youngest children are afraid of the ghost in their home. Now, this is the first time anything like this is just said outright. The suspected cause of all this misfortune being paranormal. To add to his point, Dad also brings up the missing husband before him, as well as Takaharu's accident. But who the hell is Takaharu? Through images and voiceover, we discover that Takaharu is the third son of the family who passed away at age 9 due to drowning. This clears up the child we saw on the altar towards the start of the film. Dad is interviewed about the last bit of footage we saw, and he clarifies that the money he asked about was insurance money, the payout for Mom's last husband now being considered legally dead after 7 years. Dad once again reiterates that he was hoping the money could be used to move into a new home. Now, this is when Veronica, in all of her infinite wisdom, points out that everything seemed to go downhill for the family around the time that the first husband had disappeared. From there, she interviews various children to get an idea of what they remember about their biological father.
What was Keiichiro like?
父はすごく優しい人で、家族のことを一番に考えてくれる人だったので、私たちもみんな大好きでしたし。
So why did Keiichiro disappear?
どうして圭一郎さんはいなくなったんですか？
ちょっと突然のことだったので、ちょっとよく私たちもわからないんですけど、私たちもちょっとまだ信じられないので。
気さくでよく遊んでくれるいい父だったのは覚えてて、でも時々すごい怒ることがあって、お姉ちゃんとかバンバン殴られてたりした時は僕怖かったんですけど。
Why do you think your father disappeared?
よく覚えてないんですけど、お父さん体が悪くてもう仕事もやってなかったんで、なんか悩んでたのかもしれないんですけど、でもそのことを心配してお母さんとお兄ちゃんとお姉ちゃんとかがよく集まって相談してたりしたんですけど。
He don't know why, but father was in poor health.
Why do you think your father disappeared?
なんか昔テレビの人が取材に来たことがあって、なんか心霊写真に呪われたとかそんなようなことを言ってましたね。昔うちの家族を紹介しますみたいな内容でテレビがうちに来たことがあるんですよ。でなんか霊能者の方がそのお父さんはそのゴーストフォトの世界にこう引き込まれた、連れて行かれたみたいな感じのことを言ってました。
すごく気味が悪くて、見ているだけでこう鳥肌が立つような、その写真を見た時にどこかにしまおうということでしまったんですけど、翌朝郵便受けの中にその写真が入っていたりとか、それですごくもうゾッとしてしまったので、その後にまたもう捨ててしまおうと思ってゴミ箱の中に入れたりして捨てたんですが、玄関の前のところにポツンと落ちていたりとか、それですごく気味が悪かったので一度お祓いをしてもらおうと思ってまして、でお祓いをしていただいたんですけど、それでもやっぱすごく怖い写真でしたね。
Finally, I discovered the terrible fact which was the root cause of all the unfortunate things that struck the family one by one. The ghost photo is the reason why all these terrible things are happening to this family. It's a terrible Japanese horror story. Curses exist in Japan.
Now, if you'll notice, Ryuta mentions another TV program that came to visit the family in the past, and I'll get to that towards the end of the video as well. But for now, though, we cut to an interview with Dad to get more information on how he sees this whole ghost situation. He explains that he never previously believed in the paranormal, but since becoming involved with the family, began to think there might be something wrong with the house. Now, aside from just wanting you guys to get the full picture, I wanted to show you that last extended clip so that what I'm about to say will make sense. Especially when Mikan started talking about the ghost photo and trying to get rid of it, I thought that this is where this film would change, that this would be the switch moment, so to speak. I expected it to be full-on paranormal activity from here on out, since even Veronica was on board with this being the exact reason the family had issues. To my surprise, though, this is not what happened at all. In fact, following this, things basically go back to exactly as they were, maybe even better for the family. The next time we see the Uras, it's business as usual. We see Ringo helping to make some food. She stirs it, seasons it, and then serves it directly to Dad. They do the whole, itadakimasu, oishii, and then Dan, one of the younger kids, mentions that the dish Ringo made especially for the father was one that the previous husband used to enjoy all the time, as did Enrique the cat. Mom interjects sharply, scolding Dan and basically telling him to shut up and eat. As usual, we see food brought over to Goki's room, this time by Ringo. The camera peeks inside, and what do you know? We actually get to see Goki as Ringo leans over whispering something in his ear. And I will say that when I first saw this film, I wasn't sure if Goki even existed at all, or if it was an act, since he's never actually seen until now. But anyway, we cut back to the dining room again at the start of a new meal. Veronica adds via voiceover that it had been about a month since they started filming, and that the family overall seemed much better. That is, of course, aside from one loose end. Rie, once again, attacks the stepdad, and what we get next is a sequence entirely dedicated to her. At first, things seem to play out as usual with Rie until Ringo tries to stop her. The eldest sister is pushed, and that's when Dad finally retaliates. He goes off, finally stepping up to Rie and scolding her for how she behaves, adding that her attacking him is one thing, but that she was not to lay a finger on her siblings. In this scene, Dad also declares himself the father of this family, meaning that his anime character arc is finally complete. Rie runs off into the night after this altercation, and the family follows but quickly loses her. We cut to 3 hours later, and Dad of the Year is still on foot searching for her. Another time skip. It's now midnight, and Dad finally finds Rie standing alone on a bridge. He apologizes, which is amazing, by the way. If you have Asian parents like I do, that is amazing. And the two have a much overdue heart-to-heart conversation. Now, at this point in the film, we still have no idea why Rie has this much of an issue with this guy. The rest of the kids were awkward around him, sure, and didn't really care for him, but Rie was the only one to repeatedly lash out in a physical way. We finally get her to talk, and she states that she didn't understand why her stepdad is so nice, or why he'd ever want to become part of such a dysfunctional family. This gives way to Rie breaking down and crying, even apologizing, and the two seem to work things out, or at least take the first steps towards mending their broken relationship. The next time we see the family is in June, and they're en route to a campsite for a little family getaway. To add on top of this already special occasion, Goki has even decided to tag along. He's come out of his room. The children are interviewed and talk about how they've grown to appreciate their new father, and even cheer him on as he catches fish. When Dad is interviewed, he of course says he's beyond happy that the kids now seem to accept him. Now, all this is supposed to be the happy ending, the neat bow on top. Again, in a narrative sense, everyone has a clean character arc at this point. The kids are happy with their new dad, and Dad finally found a family that he always wanted. Veronica says her parting words, and the Ura family all wave goodbye to the camera, but the film isn't actually quite finished yet. Instead of credits, we're treated to a text slide that explains that an unexpected event had forced the documentary team back to the Ura household, even though filming had actually wrapped up. We once again enter through the front door, where we find younger children of the household playing around, but what we do not see, oddly enough, is the mother. It turns out that sometime after the camera crew left, Mom had slipped off a cliff and hit her head, landing her in the ICU, unresponsive for over a week at this point. The next morning, Veronica is back at the Ura household for yet another breakfast time visit. She watches as Ringo once again prepares food, and this time she asks about the powder she's using to season the meat. Ringo explains that it's made of kelp. Next, we get one last interview with Dad, who says that despite his stance on moving, the family was to stay put until Mom recovered. As for when that might be, no one knows. It's a cliffhanger and where the story ends, but before the credits we're treated to another goodbye from Veronica to the Uras, as well as a closing monologue. We finally get a credit roll complete with a photo slideshow of the family trip, backed by that same rendition of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star mentioned earlier, and the story finally comes to a close. So, those were the events of Psycho the Large Family. What we have on the surface is a story about a large, complex, sometimes dysfunctional group of people who seem to attract tragedy after tragedy, all supposedly because of a cursed photograph. Like I said in the introduction, I had zero idea what I was going into when I first watched this film, and once I finished it, I still really wasn't too sure what to make of it. That is, until I read the comments, but more on that in a second. The paranormal was introduced and cited as the cause of all this misfortune, but if you really think about it, it's never brought up outside of that one segment we get in the film. We don't see any other potentially ghostly happenings throughout the story. In fact, to some, the inclusion of the whole ghost photograph thing might even catch them off guard and feel out of place. But if not some kind of spirit or demon, then what exactly is causing so much misfortune to befall the Ura family? While this isn't ever stated outright by anyone in the family or Veronica, it's heavily implied that the mother in the story may not be as innocent as she appears. She's someone that we can feel sympathetic towards at the start, a presumed widow whose husband seemingly vanished on her 7 years ago. Now, having said that, even though Mom seems to be trying to just rebuild her life, there's just something eerie about her, and in particular when it comes to her vegetable garden. Again, there was that whole sequence where it was just an extended shot of her tending to her plants with an unbroken smile, then her screaming at some of the younger kids for playing in that same area, telling them that she didn't care if they went missing, which is just an odd thing to say to any member of your family, let alone your kids. Now, let's go back to that scene that follows that one, where the kids were asked about what had just happened, and we learn of Enrique the cat, who was supposedly buried there. Again, we have one of the kids in the room doing some kind of homework, and when Veronica asks what he's studying, the child says this.
What are you studying?
何の勉強してるのって。
保健体育です。お母さんがいつも保健って言ってるんで、保健体育頑張んないといけないのかなって思って言ってます。
So, 保健? Okay.
The word hoken comes up a few times, and in the subtitles they mention insurance, which is apparently what that word roughly translates to. It's not a word that I am personally familiar with, so you'll have to forgive me, but according to my rudimentary research, this is how it's spelt in kanji, made up of 2 characters defined as health, strength, guarantee, and preserve. Again, I don't know kanji very well, but that seems to line up with the conversation that these characters are having. The boy essentially says that he's studying physical education because his mother is always talking about what can be translated as life or health insurance, I think. Comments, do your thing. But anyway, this of course wouldn't be the only time insurance comes up. We know for a fact that Dad wanted to move the family and was hoping that the previous husband's life insurance money could help. It'd been 7 years, so it was time to cash out. Again, I suck at kanji, so there was no way I was going to be able to read this anyway, but I heard that somewhere in the film is insurance paperwork sitting next to Mom, but don't quote me on that. Now, having said that though, am I saying that this alone proves that the mom killed her previous husband for the insurance payout? I have no idea, but it does seem to be what the movie is implying. Now, you may be thinking that's a stretch since all we have is the mom being maybe a little socially awkward and an ill-timed insurance payout, but what really solidified everything here is what I found in the comment section. Let's rewind a bit. If you'll recall, there's a sequence in this film where Veronica faces the camera and finally asks point blank why the original father of the family, the first husband, had disappeared. She interviews various Ura children about the father, and that's what eventually led to the whole ghost photograph thing. As it turns out, there was a whole lot I missed about those interviews upon first viewing, and I think it'll just be easier to show you what I mean, rather than explaining it one by one.
Why do you think your father disappeared?
よく覚えてないんですけど、お父さん体が悪くてもう仕事もやってなかったんで、なんか悩んでたのかもしれないんですけど、でもそのことを心配してお母さんとお兄ちゃんとお姉ちゃんとかがよく集まって相談してたりしたんですけど、
He don't know why, but father was in poor health.
But father was in poor health.
Why do you think your father disappeared?
なんか昔テレビの人が取材に来たことがあって、なんか心霊写真に呪われただかそんなようなことを言ってましたね。昔うちの家族を紹介しますみたいな内容でテレビがうちに来たことがあるんですよ。でなんか霊能者の方がそのお父さんはそのゴーストフォトの世界にこう引き込まれた、連れて行かれたみたいな感じのことを言ってました。心霊写真に呪われただかそんなようなことを言ってましたね。昔うちの家族を紹介しますみたいな内容でテレビがうちに来たことがあるんですよ。でなんか霊能者の方がそのお父さんはそのゴーストフォトの世界に
すごく気味が悪くて見ているだけでこう鳥肌が立つような、その写真を見た時にどこかにしまおうということでしまったんですけど、翌朝郵便受けの中にその写真が入っていたりとか、すごく気味が悪くて見ているだけでこう鳥肌が立つような、その写真を見た時にどこかにしまおうということでしまったんですけど、翌朝郵便受けの中にその写真が入っていたりとか、それですごくもうゾッとしてしまったので、その後にまた。
Again, I did not see any of these when I first watched this mockumentary, and I was beyond freaked out once I went to the comment section and started finding these timestamps. To clarify, these clips show what appears to be the mom hiding in the background, eavesdropping on the children as they're being asked about what happened to their father. Insurance talk is one thing, but this is just outright weird. It's like she's listening in to make sure that her kids don't say anything potentially damaging to the film crew. Now, none of this is ever highlighted in the movie. There's no jump scare, there's no zoom in, there's no red circle, none of that. While many horror films resort to jump scares or over-explaining, Psycho the Large Family is so subtle with their scares that, again, I missed them entirely. In fact, even upon viewing it again to write this video, I stumbled upon yet another timestamp that had my jaw on the floor and made Mom look even more guilty than she already is. Let's rewind to about half an hour into the film. This is when Ryuta falls from the second floor and has to be taken to the hospital. Upon my first and even second viewing of this, I thought that all the creepy weird stuff was kept to the previous segment I talked about, but then I saw a comment saying that the mom could be seen in the window after Ryuta's fall. I had zero memory of that, so I clicked the timestamp and sure enough, look at this. I legitimately had to pause the video several times just to catch this properly, by the way. So yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that the mom is guilty of something, even if based on the events of the film, nothing can be proven for sure. It does appear, though, like Mom pushed her son from the second floor balcony, and it's very heavily implied that she had something to do with her husband's death, and that he's buried in the vegetable garden. There's also the one child that passed away from drowning, as well as Remon's bicycle accident that was mentioned while Ryuta was in the hospital. Speaking of which, remember those seemingly random shots of fruit baskets with knives in them? The first time we see this is when Veronica interviews Mom following Ryuta's accident. There are two knives in this shot. One stabbed into a lemon and another stabbed into a dragon fruit. Now, remember how Ringo used the name apple since that's what her name translates to in English? Remon is actually a loan word for lemon, and the name Ryuta, from what I understand, can be spelt with a kanji that can also be read as dragon, hence the dragon fruit. So yeah, some very heavy symbolism in this, probably the most heavy-handed the film ever gets. But anyway, while on the topic of the children, there's also the possibility that some of them, particularly the older ones, might actually be aware of what their mom is up to if she's up to anything, and in some cases may have even helped her. In this scene, Dad is being interviewed, and for a split second, we see a figure standing behind him. This time, though, it's clearly Ringo and not Mom. Ringo, if you recall, was filmed twice adding some kind of powder to Dad's food, and while that could very much just be some Ajinomoto shit, we do have that scene where Don mentions that his dad, as well as Enrique the cat, used to eat that particular dish a lot. This, of course, being the scene where Mom basically cuts this child off and scolds him, telling him to shut up and eat his food. Why was she so angry about him talking like that? Who knows? Is it poison? Again, we don't know. We know that Ringo got herself involved with shady individuals, but that sort of thing doesn't always happen out of nowhere. We don't know why Ringo initially distanced herself from her family, and one might argue that it could be guilt, or any number of issues with the family that we didn't get to see. Then, of course, there is Goki, the eldest son and former delinquent, now shut-in. I'm not sure if this was the intention, but I seriously expected Goki to either not actually be real, or to have already been dead, especially when I first saw the altar in the background towards the start of the film. The fact that he was alive and well, at least to me, was a massive subversion of expectations. Now, having said all this, what is his deal? He leaves messages all over the walls, and I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but kanji scares me, so there's quite a few here that I can't possibly read, but I'm sure that they say some sketchy shit that someone in the comments will explain to all of us. But there are a couple things here that are in a less complicated writing format that I feel confident enough to sort of interpret. Okay, so there's these two pieces of calligraphy right here. These characters read ha ha ha, and these read psycho des. And let me tell you what I believe that this is supposed to mean. I think what we're looking at here are a couple of puns, but let me start with psycho des. Psycho is the same word that we see in the title of this film, Psycho the Large Family. Psycho is an expression used in sort of an excited way to mean something is awesome, cool, the best, etc. Then des it basically just means is. So this paper is basically in loose translation saying that something is awesome or it's the best. As for what it's referring to, it doesn't say. Then we have this one, ha ha ha, which can be interpreted as laughing, but haha is also another way to say mother in Japanese. If you squish these two pages together, it could be interpreted as mother is the best, but you could also read it as mom is psycho, as in the English word psycho. As I was writing this, I kind of realized that that sounded like a bit of a stretch, but given the whole Ringo, apple, lemon thing, I don't think that it's out of the realm of possibility to have a cross-language pun going on here. Another thing that lends itself to that is at the end of the film when Veronica says her final goodbyes to the Ura family. I cannot play the monologue due to copyright music being in the background, but here's a partial transcript of what Veronica's voiceover says. A magnificent large family, Ura family. You are psycho. Psycho, the large family. Imagine that, but with the stale Veronica delivery, you know what I'm trying to say. I seriously think that the filmmakers intended for that to be a pun, Veronica's way of calling the family psycho in English. After all, she bore witness to all their dysfunction, and it stands to reason that she might have formed a personal opinion on the Uras, even if she cannot say it outright. But anyway, if any of my Nihonjins in the comments want to correct me, I fully welcome it because I'm still accepting that I might be completely wrong here. Please cut me some slack though, because my family didn't care to teach me Japanese themselves, thank you very much. Having said all that, even if we ignore the writing on the walls as far as the narrative goes, it's at least implied that something happened to make Goki withdraw. He wasn't always like that, so it seems like something happened along the way that made him not want to socialize anymore. But we can't know for sure. For now, let's shift our attention to yet another problem child, Rie. Now, Rie lashes out for the first time very early into the film. Again, it was never overtly stated why she was so violent compared to her other siblings. At first, I wondered if maybe Dad had done something to her and she was acting out, but another interpretation that could work here is that Rie actually wanted to push her stepdad away in order to save him, even if the execution was pretty backwards and unlikely to work out in the end. It's immature, which makes sense because Rie is 16 and 16-year-olds don't have fully formed brains yet. Once she's confronted by Dad, she turns around rather quickly and it just seems a bit odd, almost like she never really truly hated the guy to begin with. And speaking of, let's talk about Dad for a second. I thought for sure at first that the dad was going to end up being some kind of villain or antagonist. He just seemed too nice at first, and again, I was suspicious about why the children, especially Rie, hated him so much. Was he a perv? Was he treating everyone poorly off camera? That never seems to be the case, though. You also have to wonder if he had something to do with the disappearance of Mom's first husband, but there's never anything in the film to imply that. Again, if anything, we're made to be suspicious that they could be poisoning the dad, at the end of the day making him just another victim of this fucked up family. He genuinely does seem to be a good guy, just doing his best, and it really does seem like the mother was the sole mastermind this entire time, even if she did use some of her older kids as pawns. Of course, there is one massive, glaring issue with that assumption, though. Another subversion of expectations came when it was revealed that Mom was in a coma. I thought for sure that Dad would end up missing or dead by the end, but nope, it was Mom. Nothing is ever truly an accident with this family, so we can assume someone pushed or maybe even just straight up attacked her, but who and why? So I would love to hear what you guys think about this, like tweet me or something, because I'm just taking a guess at this point, but I'm assuming that Goki and Ringo had something to do with it, because if you recall, we first see Goki as Ringo is talking to him, but we can't hear what they're saying. Goki then, of course, appears at the family trip where Mom's accident happened, and he's kept away from the family for the rest of the film. I don't know if it's a coincidence that the first time he's actually with everyone, something bad happens. Now, why would they do this? It's hard to say for sure because Ringo was the one making the maybe poison food and serving it to Dad, but I could see the kids deciding that everything had gone too far, and in an effort to free them from their mother, they decided to stage an accident, giving Mom a bit of her own medicine, so to speak. After all, they pretty much grew to accept their new father and saw him struggle time and time again just to win them over. Compare that to the women who presumably took their father and brother away while also trying to get rid of a couple of their other siblings, and yeah, you've got a recipe for a mom accidentally slipping and falling down a cliff. Now, I forgot to mention this earlier, but Mom being up to something is also supported by the fact that she didn't want to move. After all, if you have a body buried in your garden, you're probably going to want to stay put. Like I've said so many times though, this film does not outright say anything. It's up to the viewer to read between the lines and theorize on what they think is actually happening, and I love it for that. I did want to mention, though, that this film is technically a part of a series. Its predecessor was released a number of years before and seems to feature all the same actors, save, of course, for the dad. In this film, we actually see the first husband before he went missing, as well as Enrique the cat. This turning out to be the previous documentary experience that Ryuta mentioned while he was being interviewed. I haven't had the opportunity to watch this one just yet, and I wanted to write this video before doing so, just to keep my opinion sort of isolated to one film, but from what I can tell, the older of the two films goes a little more into the whole paranormal aspect of things. Instead of the upbeat Psycho the Large Family, the title for this one seems to translate to The Cursed Large Family. From what I gather, it's also marked as Movie 2 in the series, making the subject of today's video the conclusion in a trilogy. What is the first film about? In all honesty, I have no clue and actually haven't even found it as of yet, but would definitely love to see it one day if the opportunity were to arise. Now, since the second film seems to lean more heavily into the paranormal aspect of things, then who knows? Maybe it could be that Mom is innocent after all and things actually have been the result of some kind of curse. But not knowing for sure is what I love about this film. It really can be interpreted in both ways depending on how you look at it and what you choose to focus on. If you watch it on its own, it's this layered experience that really does keep you guessing, trying to get to the meat of what makes this family as messed up as it is. Whether it's a curse, a serial killer mother, or something else entirely, it seems that we'll never really know for sure. But I'm honored to have shared this experience with you anyway, and hope to see you guys all again soon.